Okay, wow, it really started pouring all of a sudden. Just there, I hear it's still blue sky.
It was sunny for a brief moment and then this happened.
I was talking to a friend and it was like, I was underneath like the thing in front of the library and then I hear just rain. And then when I go out, it's nothing. I'm just like cold.
Yeah, I lived in Florida as a kid, and you have the rain coming in over off the ocean, and it would literally rain, pouring down the front yard and sunning the backyard. So it's kind of like that. Okay, well, let's get going. So first of all, the quiz last Thursday, a little harder than I was expecting, in part because there was 2 questions from this week that got into last week's quiz by accident, and I apologize. So I went ahead and added 2 points to everyone's score to make up for that, for a max of 5 points. So if you did well, then you didn't get any extra points, but most people got 3 out of 5 because they missed the 2 that we didn't discuss yet. So hopefully that made up for it. Today's quiz will probably look a little familiar because I think it's was appropriate for this week's material. It might have the same question on it. Okay, who's expecting to do a UR? And remind me again your name.
Till TIO.
Okay, and did you upload a presentation?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, let me just make sure I have it. What's your last name?
Ramig, RAMIG.
Okay. Anybody else expecting to do a presentation today? Okay. Anybody online? Crystal, are you expecting to do?
Yeah, I have some of it done, but it's not all the way done. If I could go a different time, that'd be great. But if not, I can go today.
I think we could do it next week. Okay,
Okay.
that'd be fine. So we'll plan on doing next Tuesday, and remind me. Okay, and the reason why we're going to do next Tuesday instead of next Thursday is because I actually have a conflict and I have to cancel class Thursday. I'm sure you guys are all disappointed. So no class on Thursday, nothing to do. We'll just continue on with where we left off on Tuesday. We'll have to speed up a little bit next week, but I don't think it'll be a problem. So that's what we'll do. So no class. Chapter 11 practice problems due today. I'll still take them going forward, but only for half credit. And chapter 12 will be due on next Tuesday. Okay. All right. Well, let's get to aggregate supply and aggregate demand. All right, so yeah.
For chapter 12, it would be due the practice problems would be due on next
Next, so we're doing chapter 12 today, right? Yeah, chapter 12 today. So it'll be due next Tuesday. Yeah. If we get too far behind the practice problems, then it interferes with the final. Then we're turning problems in when we do the final. So we got to stay on track. So Tuesday, 1 week from today is chapter 12. Yeah, so I know that kind of puts a kink in it because that means we'll be doing our second half of our presentation on chapter 12, the day that the practice problems are due, but that's okay because the more we do that, the more you have to do on your own, figuring it out, the better you'll learn it. Okay, so if you remember last week, we talked about how income and expenditure affects the economy. We introduced a multiplier. So we learned that if you spend, if a lot of spending is happening in the economy, that spending is multiplied and have the effect on real GDP. And when people spend more because they think the economy is doing better, they spend more and that accelerates the economy doing better. And if they spend less, that accelerates the recession. So now we're going to build on that a tiny bit, but then shift how we look at it a little bit more into a standard supply and demand graph. So we'll get to that. Okay. So before we get to that, let's talk about shocks to the system. Demand shocks in particular. So what is a recession? Well, a recession is when the economy stops growing or slows down in its growth, and that is often can be caused by a demand shock. So a demand shock is when something makes demand decrease. So people stop wanting to buy things, or stop buying, or start buying less. So how does that apply towards inflation? Well, when we look at a booming economy or a recessionary period, there's two main metrics we're concerned about. We're concerned about unemployment and we're concerned about inflation. So when things heat up, prices start rising and that causes inflation. And when things slow down, people lose their jobs and it becomes unemployment. So we look at if a rising economy causes inflation, which is bad, or not great, and slowing economy causes unemployment, which is bad. So there's a trade-off, everything we do to keep it kind of in that middle ground. So when we look at aggregate demand curve, we see that it's sloping down. And if we were to superimpose our graph from last week over here, so remember our graph from last week, we had a dashed line going up where it equals real GDP equals aggregate expenditures. And then we had our consumption function that would cross it someplace and right there would be equilibrium. And then if we had a shift in aggregate consumption, or excuse me, aggregate expenditures, it would shift the line up and we have a new equilibrium. Well, if you map out where the equilibrium places are, it would overlap very well over this demand curve, this aggregate demand curve. And all that's doing is saying that the aggregate expenditures and aggregate demand are part of the same model. And today we're talking about the second half of that model, the aggregate demand. So this looks very much like demand curve from chapter 3, right? Where your own personal experience, when the price of something goes down, you want to buy more. It looks very similar to aggregate demand, but it's not quite. Oh, here, this is what I was trying to get at. Let me just skip ahead to this. This is that one we learned last week, how we have the same overlaps here. Overlaps. I skipped ahead of my lecture. Let's get back to what I was getting to. So it looks very similar, downward sloping, but for different reasons. And the reasons why it's downward sloping for an aggregate is primarily the wealth effect. So higher aggregate price levels reduces the purchasing power of households' wealth and reduces consumer spending. All right? It's kind of intuitive. If prices across the board go up, but our bank account hasn't gone up, we can't physically buy more, to buy less. So the wealth effect. Vice versa, if prices go down in relation to our wealth, we can buy more. We're seeing that now with high inflation right now. Our personal incomes, our wealth isn't going as fast as inflation is happening. So if we could physically buy less, we go to the grocery store with $100 we have budgeted, and we physically can buy less groceries with that $100. That's the wealth effect. The second effect that causes that downward slope is the interest rate effect. higher aggregate price level makes households hold on to more money and leads to a rise in interest rates. So if last week we were thinking about like factories and businesses investing. And if interest rates goes up, then they might want to borrow less because it's more costly to them. So then they invest less, build less, factory expansions and whatnot. Well, the opposite, but the same effect is true on the household side. If interest rates go up, I'm going to take my cash and I'm going to put it into something that's earning me higher interest rate. So if interest rate is 1%, I'd rather go on my cruise to Alaska with my 10,000 that I have saved. But if interest rate is 10%, I'm going to put that, my $10,000 instead of a vacation, I'm going to put it into an investment. And if I put it into an investment, I'm spending less. All right, so we're talking about here. As aggregate prices go down, we buy more. One reason is because we buy more because as prices go down, with the money we have, we can physically buy more. And one reason it goes down is that as interest rates are affected by this, it affects how much we want to buy versus how much we want to invest or spend, or excuse me, save. Okay, and then this is I skipped ahead earlier, but this is the model we learned last week and how they overlap. Okay, so when we're talking about the aggregate demand curve, just like when we talked about supply and demand in chapter 3, this is an enclosed universe. As aggregate prices go up, we demand less. As aggregate prices go down, we demand more. This is excluding everything else. This is as all other things are equal. So this has nothing to do with if there's some external factor. This is just if prices go up, if inflation's happening, we demand less. But in the real world, everything's complicated and things outside the model shift the whole curve. So in aggregate, we'll demand less at every price level or demand more at every price level. So those things that shift are changes in expectations. Just like we've learned over and over again, as a whole, if we're expecting some future state to happen, we'll start spending differently now. Changes in wealth. Right? If we have more wealth, we buy more. Oh, wait a minute. I said wealth up here is the effect that causes going up and down the curve. And then I said down here that wealth also shifts the curve. Well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is this wealth we're talking about going up and down this curve is all other things being equal, and this is wealth that comes from the change in prices. So if the wealth becomes because prices went down and we have extra money in our pocket after we buy our normal groceries, and we have an extra $10, we'll buy $10 more of groceries or whatever. So this is wealth only as a result of this end effect of prices going up and down. We're down here, the shift is happening when wealth changes from some outside factor. So the Great Recession was a good example of this, where people were feeling very wealthy because their home prices were appreciating so quick. And they're taking out loans against their houses, or they're selling their house and making an extra 100 grand. This is external to the aggregate demand curve. They felt wealthier, so they spent more, shifted the whole demand curve to the right. Likewise, my investment portfolio right now looks atrocious. I feel much less wealthy, so I'm gonna save money where I can. And so is anybody that has an investment portfolio. Okay, so just like we learned last week with this next one, size of the existing stock or physical capital, Inventory has such a dramatic effect on our economy, and how much stock is there will shift the whole curve. All right, if there's too much stock, you start selling it cheaper. Prices go down, we'll buy more at every price. Okay, government policies, fiscal policy and monetary policy, which we start to introduce in this chapter, and then we go into much more depth next 2 chapters. The fiscal policy is the policy of taxing and spending, and monetary policy is the policies that affect actual money printing. So what does this look like? An aggregate shift to the right means that every price level, our economy as a whole will want more demand, more purchasing. So it shifts real GDP to the right at every aggregate price level. Or a contracting one, a leftward shift, real GDP will decrease at every price level. That was kind of hard to see. Okay, so this is just exploring that a little bit more. So consumers and firms become more optimistic. Changes in wealth or changes in expectations, excuse me. So at every price level, they demand more. But if they become more pessimistic, they think a recession is coming, they buy less. Changes in wealth. Right? This is right now, the stock market's crashing, so everyone looks at their stock and they feel poor. This is changes in wealth. This is house prices appreciate so quick that you think you're rich because your house is worth twice what it used to be. Changes of existing physical capital. Right. So if the existing stock of physical capital is relatively small, aggregate demand increases to the right. If it's relatively large, it goes to the left. Now, can anybody explain that to me? Why, if existing capital is relatively small, would it shift to the right? Yeah, well, we learned last week. If it's relatively small, companies in aggregate will start producing more inventory. And that pumps money in the economy and that accelerates the growth. Fiscal policy, when you increase spending or cut taxes, demand goes up, or when you reduce spending or raise taxes, right? It should be somewhat self-explanatory. The government spending, we have the multiplier effect. If they cut taxes, then you actually have more money in your pocket to spend. This cutting taxes is a little bit more complicated. We'll get to next week. But in general, if you have more money in your pocket, you want to demand more. And then the last one here is monetary policy. So if the central bank increases the quantity of money, you demand more. Again, if the quantity of money is increased, then everyone has more money. You can buy more. Yeah, so this slide is just what I was just saying. It's a change in wealth goes up and down the curve. If it's a change in price level that affects our wealth, so like rapid inflation, the actual prices are increasing, and it moves the curve, it shifts the curve if there's some external thing like the housing market crashing. So some external factors decreasing aggregate wealth. Okay. So then let's talk about, so we're just talking about aggregate demand, right? So we were just talking about the downward curve, aggregate demand. let's talk about the supply side. We have to split supply side, aggregate supply side. We have to split it between short term and long term. And why is that? Well, because there are factors in the short term that make changes in certain changes inflexible. So if I have a company, I can't do much about in the short term about wages of my employees. And I can't do much about the costs of my supplies that I'm buying to make my goods. Lots of my costs, I can't do anything about in the short term. Only thing I can do in the short term is control how much I'm producing. Now we'll see next week when we finish this chapter how that's not the same in the long run. Okay, so why does the supply curve go up? It might be tempting, just like we did with the aggregate demand a second ago, it might be tempting to think of it in the way of our personal demand or personal supply, but it's a little bit different. So it goes up because of these sticky wages. They're sticky costs. So we have wages. If there's a recession or there's a slump in the demand and people aren't buying my products, what I might want to do if I'm a company owner is cut everyone's wages. The biggest expense in most companies is employing employees, but I can't do that. I mean, I could piss everyone off and they'll quit. So wages are sticky. So I can't do much about that. So if I can't control my production costs, I can't keep supplying what I supplied before, because it starts eating into my profit. So profit per unit in the short run is going to be my price per unit, what I'm selling it for, minus the production costs, which would include my wages, the cost of electricity to run my factories, cost of inputs. So if I can't control this, production cost per unit, and I can't really control this, price per unit, which we'll get into in a second, the only thing I can do to control profit is try to minimize my exposure by making less. So what other things cut into this production cost per unit? Well, wages, commodity prices, productivity. So what's a commodity? Well, commodity is anything that is fungible, that is used to produce something else. So like oil is a commodity. Electricity, commodity. These are things that I buy and I use and consume in my production of a final product. But they're not a final product in themselves. They're an intermediate product. So if you remember from before the break, we don't count intermediate goods in GDP. Right? And there's also productivity. So in the standard aggregate supply curve, we're assuming static productivity. But in the real world, productivity can change through technology or other means. So if each one of my workers becomes 15% more profit or more productive, then that might lower my cost up to 15%. So that shifts the whole curve. So in short run, aggregate supply 1 here. As aggregate price goes down, I'm supplying less, so I'm lowering GDP. All right, because that's the only thing I can control. I can't control my cost in the short run, so I supply less. But if something allows me to control my costs, then it'll shift. So if oil prices go way up and I need oil to make my good, then my cost goes even higher. So I have to cut back my supply even more. It shifts all to the left. Vice versa, if something comes up with some great new technology to make my employees way more productive, I'm willing to supply more at every aggregate price level because my cost went way down. I think the oil example for this one is really good because right now we're seeing a skyrocketing of oil. War, we cut off buying Russian oil. So everyone that has some kind of, every supplier that requires oil, within days, within weeks, has seen the cost of one of their commodities, one of their inputs double. And there's nothing they can do about it. So the only thing they can do is supply less because they can't do anything else to compensate for that in a matter of days or weeks. Okay. So again, these examples of shifting. So when commodity prices fall, right, then it costs the producers less. They have a lower production cost, so they're willing to supply more at every price. If the price level of commodities goes up, then they'll supply less, so it shifts to the left. When the nominal wage falls, so if it's cheaper to pay my employees, my costs go down, so I'll supply more. And when nominal wages rise, they go to the left. And then changes in productivity. Okay. I pause there for a second. Anybody have any questions? No? Okay, well, let's take a break. The next section is long run, which I want to do next week. So let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll do our presentation. So let's take like a 10-minute break. Oh, I have a question online. Do we have a question online?
Professor,
Yeah, go ahead.
I believe I was supposed to present today, but I mixed up my dates.
Okay, we'll have you go next Tuesday.
Awesome, thank you.
All right. Okay, since we have lots of time, I want to go over a couple more slides, especially since Thursday's class is canceled. Mainly so you're prepared for the quiz today. Okay, so just a little recap of what we were just talking about is short run aggregate supply, right? If there's a higher prices, suppliers can't do much about their production costs in the short run. So all they can really do is kind of curtail supply. Why can't they do much about the cost and the production costs or the price in the short run? Well, because the costs are somewhat fixed in the short run, and in a competitive market, which is most industries, no individual supplier sets the price. The price is set by supply and demand. So each producer, each supplier, it is controlled by whatever the market price is. So they can't control the price. They can't control the production cost. So they just produce less. And then look what happens when you produce less. Your GDP goes down. You go into a recession. So movement back on the supply curve leads to deflation and lower aggregate output. Okay. Vice versa, if it went this way, what would it lead to? If we're going this way, it would lead to higher GDP and higher prices, inflation. Right? So lowering on the supply curve, aggregate supply curve, causes deflation. Going to the right causes inflation. What about those industries that you can't, that do have somewhat control over the price, where it's not perfectly competitive? We're not talking about a monopoly where one company can set the price whatever it wants. We're talking about like operating systems on computers, where you have Microsoft and you have Apple. So they both have a major influence over the pricing. There's not a lot of other players. Well, they can set the price, or they can influence the price more than a perfectly competitive market. So what can they do? Well, they can't really control the production costs, but they can maybe influence the price a little bit and charge a little higher. Well, they're only going to charge higher if there's demand for it. So if things are going good, meaning we're going this way in GDP, they'll set a higher price. And if things are going this way in GDP, they'll set a lower price. So it has the same effect. So even if you can control the price, in aggregate, what ends up happening is you lower your prices when people are buying less. Okay. So, and let's just quickly introduce the long run aggregate supply curve, and we'll go back over this, but just a quick introduction of this is the long run aggregate supply curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity supplied if all prices, including wages, were fully flexible. So this is the long run. So what over what time period is long run? Well, there's no set time period, but it's, years. So the long run is the time it takes for all prices, including wages, to adjust. Okay. So this is what the long run supply curve looks like. A straight up and down line at the level of GDP. All right, so what is this saying? This is saying that in the long run, suppliers are never willing to supply at any price more than real GDP, and they're always willing to supply at any price up until. Why? Well, why is that? Well, it's because of the long run, they just adjust their production costs and prices to be the equivalent. Right. So if inflation is happening and prices are going up, costs are going up, because of inflation, they just charge more for their product. And if prices go up, they're charging more for the product. They just adjust employee wages to match that. So the ratios between cost and profit and revenue are all the same. Prices, it's just prices have changed. All right. So look at this graph of real GDP over the year. So potential output is the orange line, and look at the real output. So over a long run, they stay the same. These times where actual aggregate output are less or higher than potential are short run problems. And then it goes back to the mean. Right? It always goes back to the mean over the long run. Even when it's bad. This is the Great Recession. And if this continued on to now, it'll be back to the mean. In fact, it'll probably be above. All right, so I guess we'll start getting into this next week, but when you put it all together, what we see is when we hit one of these areas where it's diverging. Right, this potential outcome is going to be very similar to the long run output. This is the short run. So as you can see, when they have equilibrium points off, they'll shift. So if we are way ahead of the long run, prices will shift, labor will shift, something will shift, so we're back on the long run. Okay. Okay, now we'll call it quits there, pick it up on Tuesday, and let's do your presentation. Are you ready? Come on up. Does that look right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I like to just go by the slides here because the screen share for the Zoom won't pick up if you put a presentation.
Okay. Got it. And do the arrow keys still work, or should I just use my mouse?
I would just use the mouse.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay. Am I good?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so my presentation's on chapter 11, interest rates and the US housing boom. So interest rates have the biggest effects on one type of spending, construction of housing. And this happens at times of low interest rate when house builders will build their houses they think will sell because they want them to be considered affordable, and that will only be when the interest rates are low. And the effect on the general trend of retail, this created the massive housing boom in the 2000s, caused by inflows of lots of money into the housing market. And at the time, government policy was really oriented towards home ownership, so everyone was buying houses. But eventually the housing boom turned out to be too good of a thing, and there was already a bubble in 2006. And this meant that people were buying houses based on unrealistic expectations for the future of what future retail prices would be. This resulted in the fall of the US economy, and Fed's cut rates to nearly 0%, and the mortgage rates dropped to below 5% by 2009. So here's another real life example of 30-year mortgage rates from 1995 to mid 2017. And you can see right around here in 2001 is when the interest rates started to go down from about 9% to 7% in just 1 year. And then this continued up until around 2006 right there, where it found around a little bit of a steady 5 to 6% for a few years before going back up around 2007. And these lower interest rates were mostly due to federal cut rate in response to the 2001 recession. And they continued to cut them in 2003 because they were worried the economy's recovery wasn't good enough to generate sustained job growth. So moving on to investment spending, which is another big thing that's affected by a low interest rate. And we can see the surge of housing on panel B as the interest rate continues to go down. And also on this graph, we can see exactly where the housing boom came to a halt right around 2006, right when this graph dips down. And this rise of investment spending helped a lot with the overall economy expansion through its own effects on the multiplier process. And the multiplier process is when there's an increase of final income from any new kind of spending. This moves on to investment spending projects, which also greatly benefit from lower interest rates. Investment spending projects will get the okay from their company board quickly if they respect a return rate higher than the cost of the funds they would need to borrow to finance that project. And now if interest rates drop even lower, previous fundable projects that were just too expensive to fund now become fundable because of the lower interest rates. And if the interest rates were to rise, less projects would be approved and the company would be likely to borrow less and less money. And as the firm continues to grow, their investment spending will need to continually increase to meet their more and more expensive needs. So some of my economic inaction questions. One was what happens to planned investment spending and unplanned inventory spending when there's a sharp rise in the cost of business borrowing. So my answer was when business borrowing goes up, the company is going to want to borrow less and less projects are going to be approved for the company, which will result in higher interest rates and lower investment spending. And the second question I picked out, what happens to planned investment spending and unplanned inventory spending when the economy's real GDP growth rate increases? And I said an increase in the economy's GDP will result in the company spending more on projects, which will mean more projects will get improved, which mean the interest rates are probably lower at the moment. And that's the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you. Okay. Well, let's do the quiz. Okay. ADAS, just like last week. Put it up here.